chemistry of the brain? Are there ways we can control the behavior which strikes at the heart of society? Violence. It affects all of us, and we need to understand why. From urban cities to rural towns, violence can strike any time, anywhere, even on the drive home. One example is road rage, a criminal offense. Drivers running stoplights, swerving between traffic, tailgating, and worse. A recent survey showed that 80% of us are angry when we drive. And a 6-year study says more than 200 people were murdered in road rage incidents. Why are some of us unable to control our aggressive impulses? I'm Forrest Sawyer, and this is the final installment of Discovery Channel's year-long initiative, Hate and Violence, No Simple Answers. What is the biology of hate? Research into the complex chemistry of the brain is providing clues. Scientists are researching the range of emotions from anger to rage to revenge. Why do people with no prior history of violence suddenly act out? What makes a man like Paul Neely see red and set out to hunt down and kill his friend?
The jury has handed the court the following verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant William Paul Neely guilty of murder in the second degree, and we assess and declare his punishment at 10 years.
The 1995 murder trial of Paul Neely tells a story of how a man with no previous criminal record was overtaken by rage. He says his rage drove him to take the law into his own hands, to act out in revenge. Neely's crime was triggered by what he heard from his daughter, Charlie. She told him that when she was just 12 years old, she had been raped by a man he knew well.
She goes, "Daddy, I was raped." One of the father's worst fears, you know. And so what do you mean you were raped, babe? I said, "Who raped you?" "I can't tell you, Dad. You've got to tell me." He says, "One of your friends, Daddy."
That friend was Mike Terrell, a man so huge, 6'5", weighing 265 pounds, that he was known as Big Bird. Neely's daughter said that he had raped her while she was at home alone. Overcome by his emotions, Neely did not report her allegation to the police. Enraged, he could think of nothing but how to take revenge.
I was seeing red. I was one focus, one thing. Everything else was just like a voice or a sound. I was in like a zone.
He was yelling at my stepmom about me getting raped. Then he was talking about he needed to contact Big Bird, and he was gonna talk, he was gonna talk to him and find out why he did what he did.
Paul Neely says he lost all reason. His mind closed to any solution but violence.
In my head, I honestly knew that this man's dead.
My dad just didn't listen to no one. He didn't hear no one. It was like he was deaf, for that moment. He didn't hear nothing. He didn't know nothing other than what he was doing.
Seeing red is a common description of rage, but it's not a scientific term. People in extreme rage often report that they lose track of time, can't hear, and their senses become distorted. Many say they can't remember what happened when they were in the state of seeing red.
I remember getting in the car. I'm still in that zone, if you will. I remember meeting him. I have no memory of me driving out there, none whatsoever. My body is just, physically, I just feel numb.
Fueled by rage, blind to any option but revenge, Neely led his friend to a remote warehouse.
I said, Mike, you need to pray right now for forgiveness for what you've done to my daughter. And I'm going to pray for forgiveness for what I'm about to do to you. He took off running, and I started emptying the gun into him. I was still calm. My mind was still focused. I just calmly walked around the corner. He was laying there. So I mean, I shot him about 4 times. I knew he was hit. And he was having trouble breathing. In my head at that time, my thoughts were, he's going to die. I don't want him to lay there and suffer. I unloaded the pistol into his head. As horrible as it sounds, this is what happened.
The following day, police began a manhunt for the killer. But it ended quickly when Paul Neely turned himself in.
Okay, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
When he confessed it, he thought that he would maybe get the chair. I mean, you know, that would be the end of his life, or get life in prison. He never, ever did anything violent in his life that I know of.
What prompts a man like Neely to take the law into his own hands, to seek revenge? Can rage take us beyond the bounds of reason and cause us to act out violently?
When someone is enraged, they may lose control over their impulses. We don't understand why they do. There are some people who will lose control once in their life, but it can be a terrible thing. They can kill at that moment. But there will have never been an instance before or after. They clearly are at an extreme state of rage. And why, at that point, will they go over and act with severe violence and others will not? We don't yet know.
So what happens when people are overcome by intense rage? Scientists are beginning to investigate events in the brain which are linked with abnormal violent behavior. But before we can understand the abnormal, we need to know what is normal and what we have in common from birth. We may develop differently, but psychologists believe that all babies are born with a similar set of emotions, first described by University of California, San Francisco professor Paul Ekman.
In research completed more than 20 years ago, we found that there are a universal set of emotions that all human beings have.
From birth, our genes are programmed to convey 6 basic emotions: anger, fear, disgust, sadness, surprise, and happiness by facial expressions. The facial muscles are a mirror to our mind. We don't learn how to express these emotions, but they can be clearly recognized in human beings across all cultures.
It doesn't matter whether you're male or female, whether you're 5 years old or 50 years old, whether you're from Brazil or from Timbuktu, we'll see the same expressions and many of the same changes in physiology, just some of the same events that make up these emotions.
So we are all born with 6 basic emotions, simple reactions to the world around us. But what happens inside our minds when things we see and experience meet the blood, nerve, and tissue of the brain? This extraordinary process, which happens to us every minute of the day, is still one of the great mysteries confronting science: how our thoughts and feelings are processed by the brain. The brain is a chemical machine. Hidden deep inside is a system like electrical wiring, a network of over 100 billion neurons. The branches of each of these neurons pass chemical and electrical messages to thousands of other nerve cells. Each neuron fires regular electrical impulses. To bridge the small gap between these nerve cells, the electrical impulse pushes out minute quantities of chemicals. This action sends chemical messages from neuron to neuron all over the brain. This subconscious process prompts all our thoughts. During moments of emotion, the chemical reactions in the brain lead to physical reactions in the body.
I'm assuming there was a great flow of adrenaline. My body was tight. Beads of sweat on my forehead, burning on the back of my neck, physical feelings. Unstoppable. There was, I would say, the only way at that moment to stop me would be to be subdued physically.
So is rage the product of a chemical malfunction? A confusion of messages in the brain which translate into overwhelming physical feelings and emotional impulses? For taking the law into his own hands, Paul Neely was charged with second-degree murder. The court handed down the minimum sentence. He's now serving 10 years in the Western Missouri Correctional Center. But the rage which drove Neely to seek revenge is just one example of the emotional turmoil which fuels violence today. In 1999, there were 18,000 homicides in the United States. Are Americans more prone to violence? The murder rate in American cities is cause for concern. Though murder in the U.S. is in decline, 30% less frequent than 10 years ago, it's twice as common as in Europe, and 4 times more common than in England. But non-lethal violence is just as common on the other side of the Atlantic. You're as likely to be assaulted in England as in the U.S. Scientists in Europe are investigating possible causes of violent behavior and questioning whether some individuals may be more vulnerable to impulsive aggression than others. Throughout his life, Morley Crabb, a young man from Western England, has been troubled by an impulse for violence. Most of the time, Morley is sociable and friendly, but easily enraged, he often gets into fights. Morley says he loses all control when he's in a rage.
When I get angry, I see red. I don't understand nothing else. I just see red, and I can't understand people. I can't hear them. I don't feel pain or nothing. So I hit him so hard, it knocked him to the floor, but it forced my knuckle up here.
But Morley does not enjoy fighting. In an attempt to control his aggression, he turns his anger on himself.
I've done several things to myself in the past when I've got angry. I've even come back here and hung myself once. The police come in and cut me down. If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be sat here now.
Scars on Morley's body bear witness to self-mutilation and several suicide attempts.
I've cut myself to pieces over the past. In the past, in my life, I stabbed myself in the chest here with a bottle, and I broke it off inside me. I didn't realise for about 3 days the piece of glass was still stuck inside my chest, because I was aiming for my heart.
There is controversy over whether impulsive violent behavior is determined by body chemistry, genetic makeup, or environment and the way we're brought up. Nature versus nurture. It appears there's no simple answer. Because Morley's impulsive behavior seems to be beyond his control, scientists are studying whether men like him have common irregularities in their body chemistry that might cause them to have difficulty controlling aggression. Evidence that impulsively violent behavior may result from differences in brain and body chemistry came to light in a 1989 study in a maximum security prison in Finland. Researchers sponsored by the National Institute for Mental Health studied a group of violent prisoners. The scientists were interested in a chemical in the brain called serotonin. Serotonin has many functions. It's involved in controlling muscles, appetite, and sleep. But scientists think it also affects mood, and some animal experiments have demonstrated that low levels of serotonin are related to increased aggression. Might it also play a part in human aggression? The scientists studied 36 men serving time for murder or attempted murder in the Finnish prison. 3/4 of them were found to have committed their crimes impulsively, without premeditation. The levels of serotonin in these impulsive offenders were found to be significantly lower than average. The lowest serotonin levels were found in men who had not only killed someone else, but who also had suicidal impulses. So how might serotonin influence behavior? Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, one of the chemicals that induces brain cells to communicate with each other. Serotonin accumulates on receptors in the cell, and when enough of the chemical is present, it regulates how the cell fires. Low levels of serotonin could reduce the brain's efficiency, impairing the higher brain functions which help us control instinct and emotion. Another study focused on Finnish prisoners who had been released. The scientists predicted that those with the lowest levels of serotonin were more likely to commit additional crimes, and in 85% of cases, they were correct. For David Nielsen, a molecular biologist working for the National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C., the Finnish research was a major breakthrough.
It is amazing because you're showing that a basic chemical process in the brain has the ability to be related to a behavior.
Nielsen realized that the Finnish research raised fundamental questions about the role of biology in violent behavior.
Now we knew that low levels of serotonin were involved in these behaviors. But the question was, is this caused by something that happened in your life? Is it caused by the environment? Or are people born this way?
The scientific implications may be enormous. Could impulsively violent behavior be caused by an inherited characteristic? With the knowledge that the impulsive prisoners were different biologically, Nielsen went back to study them again. It took him 8 years, but he found what he was looking for. 60% of the impulsive prisoners had a different letter in their gene code. It was a clear piece of science suggesting a link between violence and a gene. Nielsen concluded that from the day they were born, these men's brains were only able to produce a lower amount of serotonin.
Oh, I was very excited. I mean, it was a big result. What this showed for the first time was that there was a genetic basis to how much serotonin an individual had. So it's determined at birth. And it also showed for the first time that there's a genetic basis to this behavior.
Nielsen says the research suggests that some people have a weakness for violent and impulsive actions, which is not easy for them to control. Their biochemistry could be affecting their behavior. Are genetics and low serotonin the only explanations for people like Morley Crabb, who is driven to desperate behavior? It was a fight with his girlfriend that drove Morley to throw himself from a rooftop. But what makes a young man react so violently to an ordinary occurrence?
Right, so it happened like that.
Dr. Jonathan Evans is a British psychiatrist who has studied more than 400 patients with long histories of attempted suicide and impulsive aggression.
We were interested to look at that link between suicidal behavior and aggression, and in particular, the link with impulsiveness. And impulsiveness is important here because impulsiveness is about the degree to which one has some control over behavior. How much does one wait or stop before acting? What we understand is that there's a strong connection between aggression and suicidal behavior, in that suicidal behavior can often be seen as a form of aggression turned in towards the self. It's been really difficult in the past, isn't it? Because you found it very difficult.
Dr. Evans is reluctant to believe that genetics offers a complete explanation for the suffering of a man like Morley.
In the past, what have you done? What kind of things have you done?
And he's not convinced that low serotonin levels can explain everything about impulsive and violent behavior.
How do you actually stop yourself losing control?
I've sort of counted to 10 a couple of times.
Strands of DNA. Dr. Evans searched the DNA of 400 patients who had attempted suicide. He found something else in their biology that he felt should be taken into account, something that might leave patients more susceptible to this extreme type of behavior. Probing his patients' brains for clues to the cause of impulsive violence, Dr. Evans found that many of his suicidal patients had normal levels of serotonin in their brains. But some of their brain receptors, the nerve endings that trap this messenger chemical, were not functioning properly, so their brain cells were firing erratically.
Now we can begin to understand that it's a bit more than simply changes in serotonin, but it may well be changes in the receptors themselves that influence how quickly the next nerve fires. And so we've actually found that there is a difference in impulsiveness between people who have a different form of those receptors. Now, it may well be that that receptor is not holding on to the serotonin in quite the same way, and so there's a change and maybe a reduction in the extent to which the nerve fires.
There's another big question about impulsive, destructive behavior. Why is it that men are far more likely to display it than women? Not only do men commit 90% of violent crimes in the world, they're also 3 times more likely to commit suicide. Are there elements of male biology that compel men to behave like this? Primatologist Guy Higley believes he has found some clues about male aggressive behavior in his studies of monkeys. In research for the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Higley has been studying rhesus monkeys for 15 years. During this time, he's gotten to know 2,000 of these animals. He noticed that some seemed to get into more fights than others, and he wondered if the most aggressive monkeys had low serotonin levels.
While we can't ask the monkeys exactly how aggressive they've been throughout their lifespan, we could count the scars and wounds. That should be a pretty good indication as to how aggressive they've been across their lifespan. The monkeys who are very aggressive, having had more scars, more wounds, more evidence that they were in fights. We captured our monkeys and we counted the scars and wounds. We noted the locations where they were so we could tell whether they were running away from a fight or whether they were standing their ground during the course of the fight. Then we measured their serotonin.
Dr. Higley found that the impulsively aggressive monkeys did have low levels of serotonin, but his research didn't stop there. He also investigated whether the male hormone testosterone might also play a part in the animal's active aggression. Testosterone is the hormone that defines the male sex. Tiny amounts, measured in millionths of a gram, are released in a mother's body in the 10th week of pregnancy and determine whether the unborn baby will become a boy. In later life, testosterone not only fuels the male's sex drive, but also influences the development of men's physical characteristics. Could it also play a part in male aggression?
One of the most important studies that we've had is the one where we investigated brain serotonin and brain testosterone. It's not enough to simply have high testosterone to make an individual aggressive. If you have high testosterone, but you also have high serotonin, then you tend to be competitive. You may be more aggressive, but aggressive appropriately. You stand your ground, but you don't pick a fight that might get you in trouble that you end up with physically damaging consequences. Monkeys who have high testosterone but low serotonin, on the other hand, are really in trouble. For these individuals who are impulsive, once an aggressive encounter starts, it's just like they can't turn it off. It goes on, it escalates, they're more likely to engage in it over a prolonged period of time. So if you have high testosterone and low serotonin, the two of those together are a double whammy. It is like you have no brakes and you have lots of fuel. You're going to end up in trouble a lot. And that's probably the individuals we see most often who are in trouble.
But how does our knowledge of biochemistry help us when faced with scenes like this? Reports of violent crime among adolescent males have increased almost 50% in the last decade. How much of this is due to hormones, and how much to the environment we grow up in?
I think that it's much more than that. It's also to do with the kind of environment, the kind of experiences that we have. We're born into the world with a genetic picture, but we take that through the world, and it's what happens to us that then determines the kind of people that we become and the kind of things that we do and the kind of problems that we get into.
So can impulsive, violent behavior be controlled? And what lessons can be learned from its victims? The 1989 murder of a popular young Hollywood actress provoked public outrage. 21-year-old Rebecca Schaefer had been stalked by an obsessive fan. Having tracked her down, the stalker went to her home with a gun and killed her when she answered the door. Within 5 years, her murder and similar cases led to new laws against stalking in almost every state. But despite the laws, stalking persists. Statistics suggest that almost 1.5 million people a year are stalked. Even if stalkers don't assault their victims, they can cause lasting psychological harm, as Carol Taylor experienced firsthand. Carol hates the man who lived across the road. According to her, Michael Zarnata stalked her day and night for 3 years.
I just hate him. You know, if I would have been able to get hold of that guy, he would be dead now. I'm telling you, he would be dead.
Carol's hatred of her stalker had a profound effect on her. She lost weight, couldn't sleep, became depressed.
Hatred is something that you can have for decades in your life. For some people, the hatred is something that they only think about or feel when they think about the person they hate, while for others, it's in the foreground of their mind continuously, and in that sense, it ruins their life.
Carol's story begins in 1997 in a quiet street in Preston in northern England. It's 3:30 in the dead of night, and this man is on the prowl outside her house. Carol suffered a campaign of intimidation by Zarnata for 3 years. The stalker never left any incriminating evidence, but his continual presence was enough to push Carol to the brink.
He used to give me the creeps, this guy, you know. He was just... If you ever saw him, you'd know what I mean. I mean, he's such a weirdo.
Carol's diary describes how, on the 11th of May, he watched her from his doorway as she came home from shopping. She headed for the door quickly, but he came after her. He called out just as she managed to get the door open and told her, "You'd be surprised what I know about you." But when Carol's partner challenged the stalker after one of his late-night prowls, it just seemed to make the matter worse.
I've been stood next to Carol when we've confronted him, and he's stared at her all the time, never looked at me once, which is really, like, scary, because he's got those scary eyes, you know.
I just couldn't get him out of my head at all. He sort of took over my life, really, you know.
The stalker's relentless pursuit of Carol drove her to hate him, and his intimidation tactics became more overt. Carol noted in her diary that he had scratched graffiti on the side of her car. Then one afternoon, Carol says, the stalker's bullying became life-threatening. Panicked, Carol called the police again. But to her frustration, she couldn't prove a thing. The stalker continued to harass her.
I think once the gun incident happened, you know, it did make me a lot more scared of him. You know, I used to, like, think about when I was getting out of the car at night, and I was very scared at night when there's nobody around, you know.
In a desperate attempt to convince the police, Carol persuaded them to install a video camera in the window of her front room. What they saw when the tape was replayed was shocking. The stalker's behavior was repetitive and methodical. For 12 of the 14 nights of video recording, the man could be seen systematically stalking Carol's house and circling her car, before eventually breaking into it. He never stole anything, but according to Carol, he left her personal belongings disturbed, so she could not fail to notice that something was amiss. Armed with the video evidence, the police arrested Zarnata.
Easiest way.
Alright, must tell you, you've been arrested on suspicion and also on suspicion of 3 thefts from a motor vehicle. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Zarnata was sentenced to a year in a secure mental hospital for psychological treatment. And Carol was left confused and disturbed and harboring an intense hatred.
Hatred is a really powerful emotion. It's not one that we're born with. It's one that's created by situations that we've been in and repeated time and time again. It's a mixture of fear, anxiety, all sorts of other emotions, and it's something that none of us like to admit to.
6 months after the stalker's arrest, Carol agreed to take part in a scientific experiment. Her body was wired to test her responses as she watched video of the man who had tormented her. Professor Stafford Lightman, a specialist in the long-term effects of stress, looks for the instant response that she would have felt every time she was confronted with her stalker.
So we're going to show the pictures of Cyanot and Azat, all right? Yes. Okay.
What happens to Carol's mind and body could happen to anyone under pressure from extreme emotions of fear, disgust, and anger. As Carol views images of her stalker, her heart rate starts to rise, well beyond a normal reading of around 70. As her heart rate increases, so too does Carol's blood pressure. Her face breaks out in a sweat, and the sensor on her fingertip swings its meter higher and higher as minute quantities of sweat appear. Her emotional state causes the muscles in her face to contort. Thoughts in her brain are flooding her body with chemical and electrical messages.
This is a short-term response. She has this release of adrenaline. It changes her heart rate. It causes her to sweat. But it doesn't do anything bad to her in the long term. Even if on several occasions she has this release of adrenaline, we don't think that this actually is going to cause any problems to her health. On the other hand, if she has repeated episodes like this, she can activate a different system, and she can increase the levels of cortisol in her blood.
This is a test just to measure the hormones in your saliva. Pop it under your tongue.
He expects that her saliva will contain high levels of cortisol, a hormone released during periods of prolonged stress.
Spit it back out into there.
Cortisol levels give an indication of the long-term effects of negative emotions. After years of hating her stalker, Carol's brain will have sent a continual series of signals to her body. A part of her brain called the hypothalamus will have sent chemical messages to her pituitary gland, which releases cortisol into her bloodstream. In the blood are white cells, part of the body's defense system against disease. High levels of cortisol, seen here in yellow, will damage the white blood cells.
The important thing to understand about cortisol is it gets into every single cell of the body. And if you have raised levels of cortisol for prolonged periods of time, it can affect many systems in the body. It can get into the brain, and it can actually decrease the number of cells and parts of the brain which are important in learning and memory. It can affect the liver, causing increased levels of sugar in the blood, can make you diabetic. It can affect the blood vessels so that the blood vessels can be narrow, make you more likely to get heart attacks and strokes. So that having prolonged periods of time with high levels of cortisol can be very bad for your health.
But is Carol's reaction unavoidable? Can people control their biological responses to hate? If bottling up emotions can be bad for your health, it would seem reasonable to conclude that venting them would be good. But some scientists researching the nature of emotion are now starting to think the opposite may be true. Ryan is very angry. So is Karina. Amy's feelings are being hurt. And so are Aaron's. But they're not as fired up as either Ryan or Karina. These students are playing a crude computer game. The winner of each round sends a burst of white noise through the headphones of their opponent. Angry students gleefully torture their opponents with maximum level and duration of sound. But why do they do it? Let's go back in time, just 30 minutes or so. Using students, psychology professor Brad Bushman has been testing the theory that you shouldn't hold on to your anger. You should let it out.
This theory, although it sounds elegant, is completely false. There's virtually not a shred of scientific evidence to support it.
Dr. Bushman bases his opinion on an experiment involving 700 college students. He deliberately set out to make them all very angry. Paired up, but separated into small rooms, the Iowa State students are told to write a short essay about a controversial subject. They're each invited to read their partner's essay and write comments about it. But what they didn't know was that Dr. Bushman was about to con them. He gathers their essays and hands out ones he's written, all of which are highly reactionary. The students try to be polite when making their comments, but Bushman switches these papers too. The comment forms he's substituting are all highly insulting. And as they read them, anger runs high. In the experiment, half of the students are told to vent their anger on a punching bag. The other half sit tight, twiddling their thumbs, waiting quietly. This is where the torture comes in. After venting or waiting quietly, they turn to their computers and start playing the game.
If conventional wisdom is true, then people who vent their anger by hitting a punching bag should get rid of that anger and behave less aggressively than those who do nothing at all.
But quite the opposite turns out to be true. The students who vented their anger are at least twice as aggressive, sending their partner louder and longer noises than they themselves are receiving.
Overall, men are more aggressive than women on this competitive game, but hitting a punching bag, supposedly venting anger, increases aggression just as much in women as it does in men.
So if venting anger doesn't work, Dr. Bushman has another suggestion.
Scientific research suggests that at least 4 things work. One is delay, for example, counting to 10. A second is trying to relax, such as taking deep breaths. Third, distract yourself, such as going for a walk. Fourth, do something incompatible with anger and aggression, such as helping someone in need.
Dr. Bushman's study has upset many psychotherapists who believe that venting is the best way to deal with anger. But his theory may be sustained anecdotally by Alice, a grandmother who chose tolerance in the face of an extreme provocation. September 19th, 1991. A man drove toward a small town in New York State. What happened next would devastate the life of a young child. Three-year-old Syra and her mother prepared to cross the street. As the light turned to red, an approaching car kept coming. Syra and her mother never made it across the road. Hours later, Syra's grandmother, Alice, got a call from the chaplain at Albany Medical Center.
I asked him if there was something that he needed to say, and he said, yes, he says, there's been an accident. He said, your daughter is alive. She's slightly injured. And I said, Syra? And he said, we don't know how much longer she's going to live.
You might imagine that her grandmother would harbor intense feelings of anger and hatred toward the driver responsible for Syra's condition.
Grandma's always with me. She comes in and tells me everything she talks about on the phone. She is a big chatterbox. So am I, though.
While Syra's grandmother was waiting in the hospital after the accident, a stranger approached.
He said, I'm the man that hit her. And it took my breath away. It really took my breath away. And immediately I thought about the courage that it must have taken him to approach me. I just can't imagine if I had done this to somebody, how I would muster that up. And I stood at him, I got out of my chair, and I stood up, and I immediately hugged him, and I said, of course I forgive you.
But this extraordinary act of forgiveness would soon be tested. Alice later learned a different account of the accident from witnesses. The driver had been speeding. He jumped a yellow light, hit Syra and her mother, then hit Syra again in an attempt to flee the scene.
When I realized what really happened and that I didn't feel that he was entitled to this forgiveness, I felt like he used me, like he abused me, like he raped me, and I felt filthy that I had touched this man that had wanton disregard for human life.
Alice then had a choice to make, and again, she chose to forgive.
I had choices that I could make, and I could have held on to the bitterness, the anger, the hatred, the wanting revenge, or I could have made another choice to absolutely forgive and to keep renewing the forgiveness so I wouldn't hate and be bitter, and to give her a life. And I chose to give this child a life.
Syra's mother survived, but she knew that Syra would always need 24-hour care. As a trained nurse, Alice has devoted her life to caring for her granddaughter. Her story may not tell much about the science of rage and revenge, but it could illustrate the healing power of coming to terms with negative emotions. Even Paul Neely, who took lethal revenge on the man accused of raping his daughter, now realizes that his actions caused more harm than good.
I hated him, and I harbored that hate in my heart. Hate brought on hate. You know, it just goes on and on. None of it's good.
Science is beginning to uncover what happens in the body when aggressive emotions occur. The possible effects of biochemical imbalance which can drive a young man to violence and self-mutilation. The danger to mental and physical health of harboring hatred. And the nurturing effect of forgiveness. While some scientists struggle to make sense of the chemical tides that sweep through the brain to determine whether biochemistry and genetics can provide answers to the problems of impulsive human aggression, others are looking at behavior, biology, and environment to try to find ways to prevent violence.